Have you ever heard someone use the expression, "no good deed goes unpunished"? It's often used in jest, though some people use it cynically, almost seriously, when they've tried to reach out and help someone only to feel like they got their head chopped off. Over the past 3 weeks, we've turned our attention from looking at ways in which God works in our wilderness experiences to asking God how He wants to use us in other people's wilderness experiences. Specifically, looking at how God calls us to come alongside or to stand in solidarity with people who are currently going through a wilderness experience brought on by a resurgence of a racial injustice pandemic. One of the greatest roadblocks that keeps many of us from getting involved, even when we've been awakened to situations, is that we're afraid of the opposition we will face if we do so. That's especially true if, because either of our race or our position of privilege, it either doesn't directly impact us, or on the other hand, because we're afraid of what we might lose if we do. We might lose respect. We might be called a fanatic. We might lose friends, lose influence, lose privileges that we're accustomed to. We might even be threatened with physical harm. Last week, we were challenged and encouraged by the example of Nehemiah in the book of Nehemiah, chapters 1 and 2, who came to understand, to own, and to repent of his and his people's part in bringing about the suffering of other people. And if you only read through Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 9, you would assume that they all lived happily ever after. Nehemiah did what was right. He owned stuff, went and helped people, and everything turned out great. But as in our own lives, if you read from chapter 2, verse 10 and following, and you read chapters 4 and 5, they show us that such was not the case even for Nehemiah. In fact, in chapter 2 and 4 especially, they're filled with increasing accounts of opposition to Nehemiah and what he was doing. And that's not really encouraging. However, those very same chapters also show us how to overcome such opposition. Nehemiah's name means comfort of Yahweh, or God, or another way to put it is Yahweh, God, has comforted. And throughout this whole book, we see Nehemiah living up to his name. We see him bringing God's comfort to people who were beaten down, living in poverty, and being taken advantage of by others who were in positions of power. So why would anybody be opposed to that? The sad reality is that wherever people are being hurt, taken advantage of, or oppressed, someone else is also benefiting, directly or indirectly. And whether out of misunderstanding, out of fear, or out of outright commitment to remain in control regardless of the cost, these people can often be counted on to oppose even good things that are being done. What's instructive for us in these passages, first of all, is how opposition increases and intensifies. If you look at chapter 2, verse 10, right after Nehemiah has been given everything he needs by the king, we're told that two officials in the area of Jerusalem, Sanballat and Tobiah, hear about it, and we're told they were very much disturbed that someone would come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. They were really upset that anybody would care about these people and get involved. It was disgusting to them that anyone would want to help those people. Didn't they know that those people were living in a situation as a result of their own stuff? They made their bed, let them lie in it. They don't deserve help. But they were disturbed. They didn't do anything about it. They just simply were disturbed. That was until their next step. Once Nehemiah had gotten the people together to begin the work. In chapter 2, verse 19, we're told that their response was to mock and to ridicule these people as they worked and to spread false rumors about them as they were getting ready to work. "What is this you're doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" That'll get back to the king, you know. When that didn't stop them from proceeding with rebuilding the wall, in chapter 4, verse 1, Sanballat becomes incensed, intensifying his ridicule of them. Now he moves it publicly. He ridicules them in public, not just to their face. He calls them names, and he seeks to dishearten them by emphasizing how impossible their task is. In verse 2, he says this, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they even bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, those worthless, burned out stones?" And Tobias adds to the ridicule, saying, "What they're building, if even a fox climbs up on it, it'll knock the whole wall of stones down." But it doesn't stop there. It continues to escalate. When the Israelites had built the wall to half its height, in verse 7 and 8 of chapter 4, it tells us that Sanballat and Tobiah became very angry. Then they began to plot in earnest together to come and to start a fight against them and to stir up trouble against them. And finally, in verse 11, it adds that they started a vicious rumor to demoralize the people who were working, convincing others that they were going to carry through on their threats, on their plots. This is what they said in verse 7 and 8, and then verse 11. "Before they know it or see us, we will be right there in among them, and we will kill them, and we'll put an end to their work." It even convinced people in verse 12 that the people around were starting to be afraid. They said, "Wherever you turn, they'll attack us." And as a result, they were able to get them to stop the work. They made life so difficult and discouraging for them that the Israelites gave up. It just became too much to take on. And the moral of the story is that it's not ultimately worth getting involved and trying to make a difference. Do you believe that? That's actually not what really happened. I'm just trying to see if you were listening or following along. Ultimately, the opposition of Sanballat and Tobiah did not succeed. And it was due in large part to the ways in which Nehemiah responded. And that brings us to the second thing that we learn here. You see, in the ways in which Nehemiah responded, we learn how to overcome the opposition that will almost certainly come against us if we allow God to use us in other people's wildernesses. I believe that we find the key to Nehemiah's responses to opposition in the very first verse of the very first chapter. Nehemiah 1, verse 1. There we're told his name is Nehemiah and his father's name is Hakaliah. Interesting thing, we talked about Nehemiah means Yahweh has brought comfort, and he was doing that. But Hakaliah, his father's name, means wait on God. And throughout this book, we see Nehemiah waiting on God, most often in prayer. And only after he's waited on God does he then take action. In Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 11, after we're told that Sanballat and Tobiah were very much disturbed, it says that the first thing that Nehemiah did was to quietly assess the situation. He got to Jerusalem, waited 3 days, and then he began to examine the walls. He wanted to understand the situation. He did not come in as the great Savior. I've got a great plan. You just follow me. I know what you need. He came in. He quietly assessed, took only a few people with him, and wanted to see what the situation was so that he could really understand it. Once he understood it then, he then gathered together with them. And he acknowledged the problems to make sure he understood what was right. Then he also urged them to action, helping them to see how if they took action, they would then benefit from it. They would remove the disgrace that was on them having no wall. And he didn't just stop there urging them on. He gave them encouragement as he told them testimonies of God's faithfulness to him and to other people. The result was that they began their good work in chapter 2, verse 18. Next, when Sanballat and Tobiah mocked, ridiculed, and spread false rumors about him and about them, Nehemiah responded by focusing on what was true. And that was that God was with him and them, the people he was working with. It was God's cause, and God would bring about the success that was needed. He didn't need to know what these other people thought or how they were going to stand against it. He didn't need to bother and take the time on that. He focused on what was true. God was with them. This was God's cause. God would bring the success. The result was that the people were able to go on working, ignoring the mocking, the ridicule, and even the false rumors. We know that Sanballat and Tobiah then intensified their public ridicule and their name-calling and their seeking to dishearten them. They did that in chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. But how did Nehemiah respond? He responded by turning directly to God in prayer. And he said, God, we need you to vindicate us. Turn all the stuff back on them. You vindicate us because we're following you. He didn't sit and argue with them anymore. Next, when Sanballat, and the result was, that God enabled them to successfully reach the halfway point on the wall. They kept working, they kept focused on God, they kept doing and not worrying about spending time arguing. They reached the halfway point. Now, we know, as we said earlier, that this really set Sanballat and Tobiah off. They plotted against them to fight them, to make trouble for them, even to kill them if possible. So what did Nehemiah do? Nehemiah did what he always did. First of all, he says, I prayed to God. And then he took precautions, setting up guards day and night, we're told in verse 9. That didn't solve anything because when they were working and posting the guard, they became tired. And when the load became too heavy for the people and the work became almost impossible and the people began to fear for their lives, Nehemiah did something else. He added reinforcements in strategic places. He encouraged the people to focus on the Lord and to stand firm in their work and in their task. He does that in verses 13 and 14. He also encouraged them to work together. Sometimes when we face tough times, we tend to hunker down and be concerned for ourselves, and ourselves first and foremost. But he said, no, I've got a different plan. Though the wall is too vast, we can't all do it. We could be attacked from a whole lot of sides because we've heard of the attacks coming. We don't need to fear them, but we need to be aware of them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have someone with me with a trumpet, and wherever the trumpet is sounded, like an attack is coming on this part of the wall, you leave your work and you come and gather around to stand with them, and we will call out to God and watch God fight for us. We will stand together, all for one and one for all. That was before the Three Musketeers. The result, we're told in verse 12, was that those who opposed them finally recognized that God had exposed and frustrated their plotting and their plans, and the people were able to continue on with their building project. Now, it didn't fully stop the opposition. We're told in chapter 6 that they tried another attempt at opposing them and bringing them down. But the end of that chapter, chapter 6 of Nehemiah, tells us that they were finally able to complete the wall and to celebrate it. And the people were finally safe. Their disgrace was also removed. So what do we learn from this part of the Old Testament book of Nehemiah? We learn that obeying God and getting involved in other people's wilderness experiences does not mean that we will face no opposition. In fact, the truth is we probably will face opposition if we do so. Sometimes, in fact, it will increase to the point where we're tempted to give up. But the good news is this, that if, like Nehemiah, we take the time to wait on God, to turn to God for wisdom, encouragement, direction, and protection, and if we will then do what He shows us to do while we're waiting on Him, He assures us here that He will fight our battles. He'll expose the traps that others have set up for us. And ultimately, He will help us succeed in accomplishing His purposes both in and through us. Is it scary to step out and get involved? Yes. The opposition that we face and that we fear is real. It could really cost us significantly if we step out and do this. But God, we're told here, is faithful. He can enable us to overcome any obstacle thrown out in front of us. And His perfect love is able to cast out even our greatest fears. That is the good news.